from the Compliance Kitchen. This is Sylvia, and I am looking at a recent modification by the CBP of a forced labor finding on a company that has facilities in Malaysia. And if you guys are regular listeners, you may recall that I had a episode, I think it was episode number 89, that talked about CBP forced labor and the withhold release orders, and a little bit about how that works, and also what companies can do to convince the CBP that they don't have a forced labor issue in their supply chain, so that they can be excluded from the scope of a withhold release order. So kind of tying that into today's episode, CBP in this case did modify a forced labor finding. So let's take a look at how that worked out. And so this was on September 9 when Customs issued this release about their modification of a standing forced labor finding. The company that was involved is Top Glove Corporation BHD. And the company, so this BHD, this sounds like a foreign entity, non-US entity in other words. And so they have facilities in Malaysia. And so CBP tells us that they will now permit the importation of disposable gloves made at these Malaysian facilities. So the CBP Acting Commissioner Troy Miller explained that CBP modified this finding after thoroughly reviewing evidence that the company, Top Glove Corporation BHD, has addressed all indicators of forced labor that were identified at its Malaysian facilities. Now, just a little bit of a background here. On March 29, CBP published a finding in the Customs Bulletin and the Federal Register against disposable gloves produced in Malaysia by Top Glove. CBP began to seize shipments of these gloves due to information indicating that Top Glove used forced labor to produce these products. The finding expanded upon a July 2020 withhold release order that was based on reasonable but non-conclusive information of multiple forced labor indicators in this company's production process, including debt bondage, excessive overtime, abusive working and living conditions, retention of identity documents being these indicators. Applicable U.S. law, as you guys know, prohibits the importation of merchandise that's produced, whether wholly or in part, by convict labor, forced labor, or indentured labor, which includes also child labor. Top Glove's actions in response to the withhold release order include issuing more than $30 million in remediation payments to its workers and improving labor and living conditions at the company's facilities. CBP also told us in the release that it has established a process through which interested parties may request the modification or revocation of a withhold release order or finding. The required evidence and timeline for modification or revocation may vary depending upon the specific situation. It's kind of case specific. CBP does not modify withhold release orders or findings until the agency has evidence that demonstrates that the subject merchandise is no longer produced, manufactured, or mined, if you're looking at in the mining industry, using forced labor. The public notice of these modifications, in this case for the Top Glove company, is available in the Federal Register and also in the Customs Bulletin. And again, kind of tying back to the episode number 89 that we had, the CBP recently answered various frequently asked questions in regards to forced labor imports. And so if you guys are interested in learning more about it, I have a post on that, and also again the prior podcast episode number 89 talked a little bit more about those frequently asked questions there.